Hello and welcome to a review of this game I played at the local chess club. This is a Jabava London system opening, and I have the analysis up so you can take a look at the moves the computer recommends, and let's see what we can learn from this game here. All right, I had the white pieces. I played Jeff, who had the black pieces here, and I begin with d4, the first move in the Jabava London system. You try and bring your pawn out to d4, knight up to c3, and the bishop up to f4. So it's a little more forceful than the regular London system, because with the Jabava London system you have a more active knight placed on c3. So Jeff responds with a good flexible move, bringing his knight out, keeping an eye on valuable central squares here, and I play knight to c3. So this could threaten to push this pawn to e4, so I would have a strong pawn center. So Jeff played d5, a good move in this position to kind of prevent me from playing e4, pawn to e4 here. So bishop to f4, and now we have the Jabava London system named after Badur Jabava, who played this opening quite a bit, and it ended up being named after him. I guess before that it was known as a queen's pawn opening Shigorin variation. All right. So now we have e6, one of the different responses that you can play against the Jabava London. Instead of that e6 move, you could, possibly play c6. You could even play a6. That might be a little bit slower. At some point, you might want to just play c5 all in one move, attacking this central pawn, and then I would probably reinforce it with my pawn to e3. But in the game, we have e6. I play e3. So this is a common move in the Jabava London system. It allows me to develop my bishop up to d3 and then aim at the king side. Also, e3 supports the bishop so that if, at some point, if I had a knight up here, or well, if I had a knight here and their knight attacked my bishop, at the moment the queen could just pick that knight off, of course. But if that bishop comes under fire, either by a knight or by black's bishop to d6 here, you could just let that bishop sit there unprotected, protected by this pawn. Your options could be to bring a knight up and then retake with a knight. But also, you could just retake with this pawn, and then you would end up with pawns on f4 and d4, and that would really lock down the center, especially this e5 square, preventing or making it really hard to push this pawn to e5. So, in the game, Jeff continues with bishop to b4, pinning my knight to the king, and I just continue development. I bring up this knight to, or excuse me, the bishop to d3, and this is important because there could be a threat of bringing the knight up here to e4 and adding pressure to my knight on c3, which is pinned. So, that could be an interesting way to attack for black here. And he can take advantage of this weakness that white has, because now the bishop is no longer able to drop back and break that pin because of the pawn on e3. So Jeff continues by capturing. Now the computer says this is an inaccuracy, and usually in the opening, you don't want to move a piece twice in the opening unless you have a really good reason. Now, here, Jeff is trying to double my pawns up, it looks like, but he's gotten rid of a good bishop versus, well, I have my bad bishop developed and my good bishop developed. He would be getting rid of his good bishop, which is on the opposite colored squares from his central pawns here. All right, moving on. He captures, I recapture. Now, what does the computer recommend instead of capturing? It looks like c5, where you would go ahead and attack the center here, and if I were to capture, well, then the bishop could just recapture. So that's another option that could have been played. Let's see if the computer recommended that. c5, or just knight at b to d7, castling also. But after this, the computer does recommend c5 instead of that bishop move. So the bishop captures, I recapture, and now we have an immediate knight to e4. So once again, moving pieces twice in the opening, you kind of want to avoid that, because in chess it's a race to get your pieces developed as fast as possible. If we look at the position, I have 2 pieces developed. My opponent has 1. Now there is an attack on this pawn. The computer says this is an inaccuracy, and white has a 0.8 lead at the moment. Once again, the computer prefers the c5 pawn push, because if instead that was played, if I decide to capture, then I would end up with these ugly tripled isolated pawns, another isolated pawn over here. My pawn structure would look pretty horrendous there. So here I probably, I was thinking maybe I should go after the knight here and capture. In the game, I played knight to f3, and afterwards I thought, oh, well, he can just take this pawn for free. But I guess that would waste time. I would have 3 pieces developed to his 1. So the computer recommends queen to f3 here, because then I'm threatening to capture. And if he recaptures, my queen would capture and I'd come out a pawn ahead there. So instead, I play knight to f3, and this is an inaccuracy. It looks like queen to f3 would have been better. Also, my queen, if I capture his knight, I could end up having my queen positioned here on the king side, aimed at his king if it castles over there. All right, the game continues with a missed opportunity here, h6. It looks like it would have been better here for Jeff to go ahead and take this pawn, attacking my queen. And then the recommendation here would be for me to play queen to c1. Because if I played queen to d2, you could have a future knight move that would attack my queen. But queen to c1 is recommended, it looks like. All right, now, since Jeff did not capture that pawn, he played h6 instead. This is kind of a slow move. I mean, I see what he is trying to do here. Maybe push forward and apply some pressure in the future. Or maybe not even pushing forward, but preventing me from bringing pieces up here to g5 at some point. All right. The game continues with capture. I wanted to get rid of that well-placed knight there. Now, here the computer actually recommends knight to e5, which that probably wouldn't be a bad move. You'd have a knight placed on the opponent's side of the board, but Jeff could just attack it with his knight, if I jump my knight up to e5. So I exchange off in the middle, doubling his pawns, and now my knight is under attack. So where does this knight go? I jump it up to e5. The computer actually prefers dropping back. Sorry if this is popping up on the screen. I apologize for that. I had a pop-up, so I had to exit out of that. All right, so here we have knight to e5. I jump forward. The knight can be chased away, but I figure if the knight is chased away, I could go after the rook over here, preventing my opponent from castling. Looks like h5 would be the best move here for black, according to the computer. Just gaining space by pushing the h pawn. All right, and in the game, we had knight to c6. Now, why is this a mistake? According to the computer, this is just a mistake. Well, for one, I can just take that knight and wreck the pawns over here, doubling these pawns up, giving my opponent doubled isolated pawns and also isolated a pawn, which is what I ended up doing. The computer also recommends the possibility of jumping the queen out here to g4 and threatening to pick off the g pawn. So that's another possibility. And I think in the game I considered that, but I thought I would just try and knock out the knight and wreck the pawns over here, which the computer says that's still an excellent move. But once again, it actually preferred queen to g4, which would put pressure on the kingside pawns over here. So after I captured the knight, Jeff recaptures, and now we have castling by me, although once again, queen to g4 would have been better. Okay, so now we have bishop developing with an attack on the rook. So I just centralize my rook, and the game continues. Oh, and it's interesting. The computer actually prefers ignoring that attack on my rook and once again bringing that queen out to g4 with a threat of attacking this pawn. And then, of course, if black would castle, well, then we can pick this pawn off with the bishop, and it could not be recaptured because there would be a pin with the queen on g4. It would pin the king, and then we'd have a mate threat as well here. All right, so the game continues with castling. I bring my queen up to h5, but once again, queen to g4 was preferred. But here, I still have a plan to centralize my queen, start attacking the e4 pawn, the doubled c pawns. So king to h7, an inaccuracy. Better would have been to centralize the queen in response, attacking my queen. So after that move, the game would have been about even. So I think that move would have saved Jeff. I remember during the game, around this point, he said he was out of his comfort zone. I guess because my queen was up here around his king side. Maybe he was worried about sacrificing my bishop for the two pawns, but I don't know if that would be enough, especially when I only have two rooks left after that other than my queen, and it would be hard to get those rooks into the action. All right, so the game well, what should have been played? Oh, I mentioned it already. Queen to d5. That probably would have kept the game about even, attacking my queen. The recommendation here would be to drop back to g4. So, I don't know, we might as well take a look at that. So, if this was played, the best move is queen to g4. So, we're threatening to capture this pawn and threatening a mate. So now h5 is recommended. I would have to drop back, but keep an eye on the king here. And now, what is recommended next? Looks like f6 is the best move. So you push the f pawn, and that way, if the bishop tried to attack here, well, then the rook could just step forward and guard the g pawn. Okay, back to the action, what actually happened in the game. Jeff brought his king up here to h7 to help defend these pawns. So I centralized my queen. The computer doesn't like this. Preferred was queen all the way over to a5. Well, I guess we could take a look at that. Queen to a5 attacking the bishop. Here it looks like the best move would be either bishop to b5 or c4. They're about even. But either way, then I would bring a rook over to this open file after that. So what happened in the game? I centralized my queen. But once again, it looks like queen to d5 is the best move here. In the game, we had this blunder. So a blunder is made here that just allows me to capture this valuable pawn in the center. So better would have been queen to d5. Now, if queen to d5 were played, it looks like I should go after this pawn. And then we have rook at f to d8. That's interesting. Rook at f to d8 or f6. But the game would be a lot closer if this queen had been centralized. Okay, back to the blunder that was played. After this move is played, well then I gain an advantage after capturing here, and I'm also checking the king and forking along with the king, the pawn here. So we have g6, a mistake. King to g8 would have been better. But either way, I'm going after this pawn. So we have capture. And now the bishop attacks. Also lining up on the g2 pawn. And here I was kind of worried that, if I captured here, the queen could move down here and threaten a mate. But I saw that I should be okay if I just block. If I just go ahead and block with the f pawn. So I thought, all right, I'll just go ahead and grab another pawn, and that's okay if my opponent centralizes the queen and threatens a mate in one here. I can just push this f pawn and block it. But instead, I guess my opponent, Jeff, was tired of my queen running all over the place here, picking off pawns. So he captures, gets rid of the queen. And now we have bishop recapturing with an attack on the rook. So the rook counterattacks. But I have this move counterattacking his rook. And that'll allow me to drop my bishop back here on the next move to c5 and block the path of that rook attacking my doubled pawns. So I drop back, and here I was wondering if Jeff would maybe decide to capture and then leave me with tripled isolated pawns. I would be ahead in material, but I thought, well, I don't know, that's kind of ugly. he could just put his rook in front of these pawns and start mowing them down. So instead, he centralizes his bishop, going after this backwards pawn here behind the, this doubled pawn that's blocked by the one in front of it. So f5 is actually preferred by the computer instead, but they're both about even. So let's see what would happen if this were played. So the computer says that's an inaccuracy, that's not the greatest move. Here the recommendation is actually bishop to c6, but what if we just go ahead and attack there? I guess the problem would be is that I have a chance to bring the bishop over, or excuse me, bring the rook over attacking his bishop. Here recommended is centralizing of the bishop or even blocking the pawns, but you want to try and attack them. If I play rook to b5 to defend, one possibility may be to counterattack here. But overall, the computer doesn't like this line. So back to the game. We had bishop to bishop to e4 attacking this weak pawn back here. And I thought, should I defend that with a rook? But I thought it was more important to fight for this open file, the open B file, before my opponent started doubling his rooks up on it. So instead, I attacked the bishop, giving my king room to move up towards the center, because as we go into the endgame, you definitely want to activate that king, especially when there's not many pieces on the board. You have to get your king involved. So after capture, I'm able to attack. The computer actually liked rook to c1, but this way, once that bishop moves and attacks me, now I can start fighting here. But the problem is, he still has his two rooks, and it's going to be harder for me to control this. So we have a pawn push. I push my pawn. And now Jeff does fight for the open B file. All right, so I just go ahead and exchange down material because I'm ahead by, 2 pawns? So if you're ahead in material, you want to exchange pieces off, because if we get rid of all the rest of the pieces, I'll just have 2 extra pawns that I can try and push up and promote. Whereas if you're behind, you want to trade those pawns off. That way it's harder for me to, I'll have less pawns that have a possibility of promoting to a queen in the end game. And you want to keep your pieces on the board because, if there are a few pieces left, you could always have a chance of some type of comeback. All right. The rook attacks the backward pawn, but it's protected by the bishop. So now we have the king moving up into the game. Rook shuffles back over to the B file, and I start pressing forward with the pawns, blocking the path of the rook, giving my king more room to centralize up here on E3. The bishop drops over here to C4, maybe keeping an eye on this D5 square, so I can't push the pawn. I just push forward here. This puts the pawn on the dark square, so I'm trying to get a lot of my pawns on the dark squares so they cannot come under fire by the bishop. The only bad thing is that my bishop is on the dark squares and it can block the path of my bishop. And I also thought I may be able at some point to reroute my bishop up here and block the scope of this rook, if that rook moves from the b file. So now we have the rook pressing forward, staying on the b file. I just centralize my king some more, although the computer recommends h4, to prevent this pawn from pushing forward and the king from getting into the game. So now we have a mistake here, an inaccuracy. King to g7 would have been better, trying to get that king into the game. Here, it looks like the best thing would be to go ahead and just capture. And I did not do that. I decided to just push this pawn forward and start running with that passed pawn. Now we have the attack here. I push forward with g3. That way this pawn cannot press forward, or I would just capture, and then if he recaptures, my king could capture. All right, so we have pawn pressing forward. I bring my pawn up to h4 to prevent his pawn from moving to g5, and the king steps forward so he can follow through with the plan of pushing forward and attacking my pawns. I centralize the rook, but more importantly, place this rook behind the passed pawn to get ready to start marching that pawn up the board. So we have capture, capture, and after this attack, I ignore that and start running with the passed pawn. Because now, if you are familiar with the square of the pawn, which is this square, you draw a line from the pawn to the edge of the board in the direction you're trying to go to promote it. And then you create a square, and if the king cannot get inside that square, then the king won't be able to stop that pawn. So another reason why it would have been good earlier to centralize that black king. All right, the rook drops back, but now it's too late. Because if the rook tries to block, my bishop will be able to attack that rook, and then I'll be able to press this pawn forward. I'll either take the rook, or if the rook moves, I'll push the pawn forward, and he'll have to sacrifice the rook to knock out that promoted pawn. So this is where Jeff resigned at this point. All right, well, let's take a quick look at what the game review says here. It says sudden, a close game that was lost by a mistake. And in this game, it looks like it was kind of even in the beginning, and then I got a slight edge, but then let it fizzle away before a mistake, the blunder was made that gave me the advantage. And even then, I started fizzling or dwindling, I guess I should say, dwindling away my advantage, but not enough, because then in the end, that passed pawn pushed through. All right, looks like I played at 89.9% accuracy. Jeff played at 81.1% accuracy. Which is not bad. I would say anything in the 80s or higher is good. So now we have 4 inaccuracies by both of us, although Jeff had 2 mistakes, 1 missed opportunity, and 1 blunder. Now, I do have to say, Jeff, according to this, played at a 1950 level, so that's pretty strong. I believe Jeff is around 1,000 rated player, so he played at 1950. Says that I played at 2,400. In the opening, I had 99.4% accuracy. Jeff had 96.2% accuracy. So middle game, 87.4% accuracy for me and 73.9% for Jeff. And then in the end game, I had an 89.2% accuracy, and Jeff had 76.5%. So, hopefully we learned a little bit. I would highly recommend that you go over your own games, review them, Now, preferably, you just want to review the game on your own without the help of a computer at first. And then once you do that, then you can put the game into the computer and see what the computer finds that you missed. But anyway, review those games. I hope this was a helpful game review here, especially if you decide to try and play the Jabava London. You can kind of learn from the inaccuracies that I played and hopefully learn from the mistakes that we had in the game. All right, feel free to leave comments. I always enjoy hearing from viewers and subscribers. Like and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. Thank you for watching and have a super chess day.